Good evening, and is this on? Okay, good evening. Welcome. My name is Paul Hungerford. I'm superintendent at Gratiot Isabella RESD, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here for a presentation regarding digital dopamine. And first and foremost, I really want to send out a heartfelt thank you to Mrs. Jennifer Verlegger and her staff here at Mount Pleasant Public Schools for allowing us to have this event here tonight. So thank you very much. Also, another thank you is to Project Aware. They're the ones that, as you entered tonight, they had the book, free book for you to have, Anxious Generations, and so it's a great read. This is a very powerful topic and one that we're glad to bring and assist to bring to you tonight. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Mrs. Shelley Ducharme.
Good evening. As Superintendent Hungerford said, I'm Shelley Ducharme. I'm the Associate Superintendent at Gratiot Isabella RESD. And I am so honored to be able to introduce Dr. Jim Harris to all of you this evening. Dr. Harris is not only a highly respected expert in his field, but he is also a partner and a friend to our region. So he is the clinical director of Marshall University Behavioral Health Center and assistant professor of clinical social work. And I told him I'd have to read that because that's a mouthful, which makes his work with us and his expertise undeniable. He also brings a wealth of practical experience to the table through his consulting opportunity company that he runs, he has founded in Leeds. So Gratiot Isabella counties, the local districts, we have had an ongoing relationship with Dr. Harris, a partnership for the last about 5 to 6 years. And he works with all of our educators on various levels throughout the region. So Dr. Harris presents to our teachers, our paraeducators, counselors, school psychs, superintendents during what we call our regional professional development days. And those are days in November, which all of our local districts are invited to attend for a day of learning together. And Dr. Harris has led us in that work for, I believe, 2 years. He also serves as a trusted leadership coach in which he is working on a monthly basis within all of our buildings across Gratiot and Isabella counties to support our building level leadership teams as they're reflecting and analyzing the behaviors and the things that are happening in the school and helping the building leadership teams develop systems, analyze the behaviors, and provide an environment that all of our students can be successful. So he serves as a coach throughout the school year with all of us, and that is we are in year 4, I believe, of that cohort. So that's an ongoing support that we have from Dr. Harris. And then the last thing I'd like to mention is that Dr. Harris is charged at the end of every school year with keeping superintendents and administrators from all of our districts engaged in learning together for a day and a half in the last week of June. So if you can imagine what that is like to try to keep everybody engaged in learning, and he does it with, flying colors, we are all engaged. And not only is he helping us learn more about what students these days need, but he helps us culminate our school year together and really start thinking and get inspired and start planning forward already for the next year. And so that is no light task. That's a heavy responsibility, and we are so blessed and appreciative to have that partnership with Jim. But for today, Jim will be addressing a topic that, like Paul said, it's incredibly relevant to all of us, digital dopamine and the effects of technology on our young adolescents. Our goal for you all this evening is really not to convince you that technology is good or bad or make any decisions about technology. Really what our goal for this evening is is hoping that you leave here feeling a little bit more informed and empowered to make some decisions for what you're willing to accept or what you can support and influence in your home and with your children. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Jim Harris.
Appreciate you. Thank you, Shelley. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Shelley and Paul. Well, listen, it's 7:05 on a Tuesday night, and you get huge street credit from me for the fact that you're here. I think that says a lot about who you are, the fact that you took time out of your evening to hear some information that will help you help the young people that you care about in your life. So I think we're all of like mind if the fact we're in this room together. Tonight is a very important topic to me. I feel like it's one of the most important topics that I talk about right now because I think the impact that we are seeing that technology has on young people today is something we need to be talking about. I think there's a lot of absolutist perspectives on technology and mental health and things like that, but my job tonight is to just keep us in a conversation. I think, I do a lot of the work with the RESD and in different parts of the country, and one of the things I talk about is the stages of change. And I think one of the things we often skip when we're helping people understand what things they might want to change is this opportunity to think and talk together. And I think this is a really important element, not only amongst ourselves as adults, but with the young people that are making the decisions and will eventually become adults, is are we thinking and talking, and not only teaching young people, some of the consequences of things, but teaching them how to be better thinkers about the decisions they make, teaching them about what it means to have personal discipline and the impact that the decisions they make on their own choices and their own outcomes in their own life. So I'm also a dad. I have a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old at the house, so this is obviously very personal for me as well, and something that I'm living and struggling with on a daily basis. So I know it's not as easy to say as like, well, just do this or just do that, because it's easy to say that when you don't have kids that you're navigating. It's much more difficult when you're living that day-to-day life. So we're going to talk just a minute, but I want you to understand we're going to talk for about an hour. So about an hour on one of the most complicated topics in society today, so adjust your expectations accordingly, right? So we're going to make sure that we're talking about some relevant things, but I'm really just going to try to unearth some ideas. In case you can't tell, Joe didn't mention, I'm obviously not from here, in case you couldn't tell yet. I'm just like I'm from the most southern tip of Ohio. I'm right outside of Huntington, West Virginia, which is where Marshall University is, if you know, like we are Marshall, and we used to play CMU back in the day and all that. So that's where I'm from. So not everybody where I'm from has this bad of an accent, but my mom said I watched too much Dukes of Hazzard as a kid, so we'll see. So I have to frame it this way. Any teachers that have heard me speak before have heard this element of the conversation, but I think if we don't start here, then everything I say after this is not framed properly. I believe that there's three elements of effectively supporting young people and making things work, and that's state, story, and strategy. So state is the mental and physical condition that we're in when we encounter a challenge or we're supporting young people. So that's why adults that take care of themselves, it's critically important that we are as healthy as we can be, because dysregulated adults cannot co-regulate with children. So the first part of being a good supporter of young people is being a good caretaker of yourself. So I think the state element, that's a whole other conversation. And story is the central element I think we need to spend some time talking about sometimes, which is our thoughts and beliefs about the challenge that we encounter. And I think one of the elements that I see that gets in people's way when they're trying to support young people is the difference in these two questions. If the first thing we ask if we say to ourselves, what's wrong with kids these days, you hear the tone of that. And the way I always explain it this way is like, if you went home with your significant other tonight, or you got home if they weren't here, and you walked in the door and your significant other looks at you and said, I was thinking a lot about you tonight. And you think, well, that's kind of neat. And then you think, they said, I even made a list. I was making a list. Like, a list? That sounds like, that's touching. Like, tell me about this list. Like, I was thinking of all the ways you could improve as a person. Now, Think about how that makes you feel. Like, that's a good counselor question, right? How does that make you feel? Your reaction is probably like, you know what, I got a little list myself, and you want to get to your list first, right? Because what you hear in that, what you're reacting to is contempt. Now, contempt is different than criticism. Criticism has a little bit of a paralleled nature to it, but contempt is when you're like talking down to the other person. You see the other person as less than, and John Gottman, who's one of the most respected relationship researchers in the world, found that the frequency and intensity of contempt in a marital communication is a top predictor of divorce. So if you watch, especially when couples fight, how quickly they go to contempt and how strong their contempt is communicated is a top predictor of divorce. And what I've found is when people talk about young people and what's wrong with kids these days, it's with a tone of contempt. And what happens is kids can feel that on you. They can feel the fact, and nobody really wants to problem solve with someone that looks at them as damaged or not worthy. And I think it's a different, I'm not telling you, don't mistake what I'm saying. I'm not telling you to be friends with your kids. I'm not telling you that at all. I'm telling us to be leaders, mentors, thought partners. That's what kids need from us. They don't need more friends. They need to go make friends, and we can help them learn how to make friends. What they need from us is they need people who are considering a better question. And the better question in my mind is, what do kids need these days? And I think of this as a hip-to-hip kind of position. I think of sometimes with my older son, Jake. Jake's 17. He's getting ready to go to college. And I've said through the years, like, same team, buddy. Like, at times when he's feeling like it's me versus him, I said, same team. And he was like, what is that supposed to be? I'm like, I'm in for your interest, man. Like, I'm in for, now that doesn't always mean like, man, I appreciate you straightening that out. Man, parent away, let's go. Bring me the discipline. That's not really how it works. But I think when I think hip to hip, it's like a physical or a visual representation of shared perspective. Because what's wrong with kids these days is nose to nose. It's about me versus you. It's about authority, beating, and making the younger person submit. But when I talk about hip to hip, it's about me considering where my kid's been, where my kid is, and where my kid's going. Where have I been? Where am I at? And where am I going? And we're both going to a future that neither of us have lived in. So, like parenting now, we're all moving into something we don't know what's next. And especially as you talk about the way that technology is advancing. So I think in my mind is what do kids need these days is the more powerful way to frame the conversation we're going to have tonight. Now, I'll just say this about this slide. Everything on this slide, a previous generation thought was going to ruin the current generation. Is that fair? Yeah. I mean, you look at the difference in social structure and experiences and TV and things like that. The example I commonly give is like, back in the day on TV, and that's all of like 1956, they wouldn't show Elvis from the waist down because they're afraid his hip gyrations would cause such social upheaval that teenage pregnancy would explode, right? But now you turn on TV and I was going to think of Cody, my 14-year-old, and it was like a few years back, and Dancing with the Stars was on TV. You guys all know that. Seems like a very family-oriented show. But we're like flipping through the channels, and there's like a big NFL wide receiver, former NFL wide receiver, in the middle of the dance floor, and an almost dressed lady runs out and climbs up one side of this man and down the other side of this man, doesn't touch the ground in between. And I look over, my 14-year-old son is leaning in, right? Now, you think about her lack of clothes alone in 1957 is pornography. But this is after dinner TV now. So I think understanding the social shift is critically important, that kids are growing up in a more complicated society. And the one thing that I would ask us to consider is that, let me ask you this question. Raise your hand if you're raising a teenager in your house at this present moment. Okay? Leave your hand up if you'd be willing to trade places with your teenager and run back your teenage years. Anybody interested? Now, what's interesting about that question that I can't find any other time in history where this has been the case. I think this is the first time where the older generation looks at the younger generation and we believe they have it harder than we had growing up. Now, I'm not talking about remote controls and microwaves. I'm talking about the social context in which kids are growing up in today. We would not trade it because we think it's harder than what we had to deal with. And what that speaks to is a seriousness and an urgency in our knowledge, skills, and abilities in supporting young people today. I think about the ability for a young person to make a life-changing mistake now that didn't exist when I was growing up. That with a picture, with a text, with a whatever, that can go out into the world, that can cause life-changing consequences to a young person today. And I think maybe none of you can, if this is your case, although it may be Shane. Sorry. Like, I can think of times as a young person maybe not Shane, he's a good guy. But in my late teens and early 20s, that there were nights when my buddies and I were making a sequence of poor decisions. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it, right? And had we had the ability to, we'd have thought, hey, this is really fun, and it's disappointing that some of our buddies can't be here. We should record our stupidity and send it to the people who aren't able to make it. I can't promise you, if I think of my 18, 19, 20-year-old self, that I wouldn't have thought, especially in the context of some of my buddies, that we would have thought, we should record this and we should send it. But thank goodness we didn't have a camera in our pocket. And back in those days, you had to look like a newscaster to record anything. So I think one of the things we want to consider, it's easy in our 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old minds to have contempt for what kids do these days sometimes, but given the same circumstances, in our younger minds, might we have made similar mistakes? Might we have been vulnerable to certain? So I think that context is the place we have to start from a story perspective before we even start talking about cell phones and TikTok. Because that helps us understand that this is not a simple context in which kids are trying to navigate. It's critically important. And the element of what we're trying to create, these are my boys. They're not cute anymore, so I always use old pictures of them. Although I did throw this in just for them. These are what they look like now, but I think when I think about our goal, and I say this all the time to my kids and other people's kids, and we're really talking about this at the RSD, like how does this move forward, is my son of a little while back he mows grass for extra money, and there was a weekend, and we're like, he has to take my van for the mower to go mow, and so he has to schedule with me when he can use my van. And I said, hey, if you're going to mow, you got to mow Tuesday night. And he's like, well, Tuesday, Ethan and I were going to go play basketball. And I'm like, sorry, dude, Tuesday's the night you can use the van, and that's the night you're going to mow if you're going to mow. And he goes, why can't we just do it another night? And I'm like, Tuesday's the night. And he goes, you're mean. Anybody, your kids ever tell you you're mean? Right? Happens. And I said, and I looked at my son, I said, son, you're mistaken. Our goal in this house is not to raise happy children. And he yells into my wife, who happens to be the principal of our elementary school, and says, Dad doesn't want us to have a happy childhood. And my wife yells back in, me neither. So I said, son, our goal, we realize that there's going to be times when we're going to have an unhappy landscaper in our house, but our goal was a functional adult. That's our goal, is functional adults. So I think that goal is really the desirable goal for any young person, because that's the starter kit for happiness, is are we a functional adult? So I think sometimes there's this balancing act between happy children and functional adults that we're always kind of navigating as parents, and that's not an easy thing to figure out. And also, it's very child dependent. Anybody that has more than one kid knows that usually if you have more than one kid, their temperaments are never the same. You can parent them the exact same way, and they'll respond differently to those discipline strategies. So I think that's what makes it even more complicated, is if what worked on the first one would work with the second one, you'd have a head start. But what works with the first one doesn't work with the second one, and now you got to get a whole new kit going. So when we start talking about these things, is we want to build functional adults. Now, today's not a day to where I want to talk about how awful technology is, and technology is a tool. And the tools can be used to do very useful, effective things. It's done a lot of useful and effective things in our society today. Okay? We know that it facilitates social connection, right? We know that it does things like accessibility. There are people, I always say disability is a function of, oftentimes, of what tools you can have that make you able to participate in society. Like, for example, I have really bad vision. So with my contacts out, I can't see anything. I can't see the big E, none of that stuff. But because I have contacts, I'm a functional adult. But you put me back in like the caveman days or whatever, I'm either a really good like horse that carry buggies, or I'm meat, right? Because I can't see. So my context now, because I have a correction, makes me functional. So technology does a lot, and I think we're going to see with the emergence of AI where it's going to remove a lot of barriers for people with disabilities and such. So we've got to be careful about demonizing the tool itself and be thinking about what is the function of it. So there's ultimately all these things that factor in, even things like safety, like crash detection on a phone. You know, it's fantastic now that we have phones that can detect and alert and get help to someone. I'm sure it's already saved people's lives. I know the fall detection, there's multiple examples of where that's saved people's lives. Now that with that, also that tool can go all the way to the other side where Life 360 completely dominates the way someone's parenting their child, and they're like, you went 36 miles an hour down Main Street, and we need to sit down and have a serious conversation about this 36 mile an hour travel. And then the kid constantly is under surveillance, And some of that, we know that as that surveillance never goes away, then I'm never learning my own skills. I'm never learning how to, and there's the good of it is we can also know when kids are safe, but there's also a place where things get to the point to where we're now damaging the development towards functional adulthood. Why am I interested in this topic? Because I have seen this have a personal impact on myself. I have to create very strict boundaries with myself in technology because it's smarter than I am. Be completely honest with you. If any of you have interacted with certain, like one of the ones I realized very quickly, if you've ever interacted with TikTok is the most beautifully designed piece of software to manipulate every weak spot in your neurology. It's beautifully designed, and it's smarter than we are. So the only way you can beat it is to not let it get a hold of you or have very strict boundaries about how it gets a hold of you. You know, we talk about like the reason why I don't have TikTok on my phone is the same reason why I don't carry cookies in my pocket. Right? Because I can't be trusted, you know? I know myself well enough to not mistake my strength. So I know that there are things like, I know if I'm a decently educated person and TikTok can steal my time, what does it do to a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old? Like, it's a very strong element. So I see that in how it affects me, and I translate that into how it affects other people. And also with my kids, I've watched us wrestle with the concepts of the different types of social media, the ways that kids react when they get things taken, those kinds of things. And I've seen the impact that it's had, and it's been a wrestling thing for me. And my kids are pretty good kids. But when you remove something and a child reacts to it as if they are someone who is addicted, and you remove it and they have the emotional reaction that someone would have in an addictive situation, that's when we've got a real problem there, because that behavior is an indicator. So I think those are things that we kind of talk about. Educational impact, I was just talking about this at a school today. I think a lot of teachers that I work with are in buildings that still have pretty liberal phone policies. It's one of the number one disciplinary issues, especially at the middle school and high school level, is trying to navigate and regulate phone usage. 15 years ago, it wasn't even a thing to talk about, really. But now it's one of the primary disciplinary elements that teachers are dealing with in the classroom that doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the instruction in the moment. And the general social impact, I think we have seen a decrease. We can, without any argument, I feel like very confident in saying young people today in general have a general social emotional delay. And what I mean by that, I'm not saying like they have a neurological like autism or whatever. What I'm saying is they have a delay, which means they're behind in some instances where they should be from a social emotional standpoint. There's two contributing factors to that. I do think the pandemic had something to do with that, but it's not the whole cause. They did miss out on a lot of essential childhood experiences because of the pandemic, because we were isolated, not engaged, and it did increase a lot of things like anxiety, depression, and so on and so forth. But I think the other element is while they're interacting with devices, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, they're not doing the things that kids need to be doing to develop their own skills. So it's the lack of access to experience that has caused delay. So now we have to take very seriously how are we going to facilitate the social emotional development of kids in order to be successful in the environment. As this thing is, there we go. Oh, it clicked to my other thing, that's why. Sorry about that. So here's the two areas that we're going to talk about. I think oftentimes we want to talk about app-specific concerns, but there's two elements. It's experiential deprivation, which is a fancy way of saying missing out on things, and then there's content impact. So experiential deprivation, we'll start here. Here's a question for you. What are these kids not doing? What are they not doing? Talking, looking at each other. What else? What is it? Climbing the tree. Moving, yes. Physical activity. What's that? Yep. Now, teenagers sometimes will challenge us on that and say, but what if they're chatting? What if they're snapping back and forth? And I would say, yes, that is still communication, but it's the element of what I would argue is that it is a very distilled version of communication. So what we're also noticing is things like the ability to read nonverbal cues is decreased because the way you learn how to read nonverbal cues is by reading nonverbal cues. The way you learn how to, so I think there's an element of, you could argue that they're socializing, And one person said, well, the one boy's looking at the other girl's phone. And I'm like, yeah, but it looks kind of creepy. I don't know if she knows that, right? Like, so we look at this whole dynamic and we say, it doesn't even matter what apps they're on. It's what they're not doing that we first should be thinking about. Because at this age, there are things that are essential experiences that help them to develop the skills they need to develop. Because in our teenage years, we all talk about the terrible twos and terrible teens, it's when your brain reorganizes itself. And the way I explain teenage neurology and how it where the technology element can be very disruptive is in your teenage years, it's like if you might have like a closet or a drawer where you keep a bunch of stuff. Does anybody have that closet or drawer where a bunch of stuff goes, right? And what's the first thing you have to do if you're going to clean that closet out? What's the first thing you got to do? Get it all out, right? So the first thing you have to do is get it all out. So the reason why in teenage years there's a very disorganized neurological state is because your brain just kind of gets it all out. And then what happens is when you reorganize the closet, you walk around and you look at all the stuff you've just gotten out, and then you're going to decide, what things do I want to keep? What things represent who I am now? So you look at something, you go, you know what? Probably not going to rollerblade anymore, so I can get rid of those. Or I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to do that. And then you put it all back in the closet in a more organized way. That's basically what's happening neurologically speaking for kids. So what they're doing is their brain's kind of coming apart, and then it's coming back together more efficient. And it comes back more efficient because it gets rid of the stuff it doesn't need, and then it strengthens the connections that it needs. So the reason why that's so important with technology is if while that brain is out and in that vulnerable state, which is why trauma, especially even at this point in life, can be even more damaging, is because when it goes back together, there's a disruption in it by whatever's been interfering with the signals in communication. Does that make sense? So when you put it back together, it's not back together, and it's been I won't say contaminated because it sounds dramatic. It's been affected by the things that it's seen and the things that are going on. And that's why that's such a sensitive time when that whole process is going on of efficiency and effectiveness. Now the tricky part we also have now is the idea of adolescence is lasting longer than it ever did before, because there's these three components of what it means to move through adolescence. The first one is physical maturity. Now the thing we know, and this is not a debate now, we know this very clearly, is that kids are developing physically earlier than they did in previous times. So kids are hitting puberty earlier than they were before. So the reaching physical or sexual maturity is earlier than it once was. Okay? And there's all kinds of debates that people are going to have about what that is, and there's probably multiple reasons that's the case. But then what's also happening is the second two are critically important: psychological independence and economic independence. So what is psychological independence? Psychological independence is your ability to solve problems that's commensurate with your current age or developmental state. So it's like, can a 14-year-old make a meal for themselves? Can an 18-year-old, 15-year-old, 16, we'll call it 16, I'll just be fair, 16 to 18-year-old call and schedule an appointment? You know, there's certain things that we think about. Are there things psychologically, can this kid do for him or herself that would make sense for a kid at that age to be able to do? Can two 9-year-olds problem solve together? So we start looking at these ideas of physical maturity. Now the problem we run into there with the psychological independence idea is as we do more for kids, they have fewer skills, and then they're again delayed in their psychological independence. So if I don't let kids, like for example, order their own food in a restaurant, which sounds like but I've had 18, 19-year-old kids that I've treated in therapy that can't order their own food at a restaurant. And the explanation might be they have anxiety. I'm like, well, okay, but like, what's going to happen when are they just always going to have someone in a restaurant with them for the rest of their life? But you don't understand. I completely understand they have anxiety, but I know people with anxiety that can order, a burger and they're going to be okay. But we start looking at this element, and that's where that safetyism starts to kick in, and that's where sometimes that overprotection or over element, then it undermines the psychological independence. Now, one of the things, and this is a short aside, one of the things we really have to be thoughtful of about what psychological independence, if we undermine that for kids, and I always think about, and there's all kinds of reasons why this might be the case, but there was a lot of young men that I treated when I was in private practice that were like in that 20 to 24 year range, and they've been told they've been like worshipped their whole life and told they're special rainbows and they're so handsome and the world's whatever, and then but they don't develop any skills because everybody takes care of them, and then they get to 21, and then the parents would come and like meet with me and say, hey, can you get him to leave our house? Like, we're kind of tired of him now. We'd like him to leave, but we can't tell him that because he gets mad at us. So can you tell him to leave, or can you make him leave? But the problem with that is that then we would have these, I would have these young men that I would come in to treat. Now again, there's also multiple reasons why someone might not be, but there were a lot of young people that I found that I was treating, and they were 21, 24 years old, but they didn't have any skills. And what happens with that, though, is they would not be ready to engage the world. They weren't formidable, is what I would say. So then what's happening is they start to become depressed. They start to become anxious. Why? Because they watch their peers leave them, and then they're not capable. And then what happens is they actually start to resent the people that created them, which is their parents. And they start to look at, then the relationships become toxic because they're overly dependent. And they realize that at 23 years old, I should not be overly dependent on my parents. And that idea of that psychological independence is something that we really have to think about. And it's not an 18th birthday issue. And economic independence is the other thing. What is that? That's the ability to, in adulthood, to be able to reasonably fund your existence. And I think this is also another area where we got to be thoughtful. And I'm just telling us we got to think about this. Is I see a lot more parents hanging on to kids longer in the "I don't want you to have debt" excuse. But you can just keep living here, and you can just bank your money, 24-year-old, and then you'll have a great down payment for your new house. But the whole time, I always say it's. I had said this to somebody that was talking about there. It's you can't learn to be a man in a room where you were a boy. You can't learn to be a woman in a room that you were a girl. You got to go lean in. And that might mean that you've got to have a little bit of debt here and there and all that, because the safe environment, the financial safety element is oftentimes at the expense of the psychological and independent element. Because the problem is if I might have financial stability, but if I don't have pro-social skills and life skills, then I'm going to struggle to build relationships and all those things. That the money's the easier part to catch up with later in life. The social skills are not. Those are the ones that are much harder to catch up on. I don't know if anybody else had student loans like I did, or anybody else didn't pay cash for their first house or anything like that. It's a regular thing to do. So I think we start looking at this idea of kids are forming who they are. And I think that's why when we look at experiential deprivation, why it's so important is because it's hard to form who you are when the feedback you're getting is mostly artificial. Mostly the best version of themselves that you see. Because often we know that the version that people are seeing online is not the real version of people. It's the best they can put forward. Filters included, right? It's the best that they can put forward. And then kids are experiencing this artificial existence of engaging with this information, and they're trying to form themselves based on what they're seeing, but what they're seeing is a delusion. So where you build a better sense of self is with real people and real challenges. And I think that's where this formation of self comes in. And I always talk a lot about the self-concept with content. I think as therapists, we unfairly or inappropriately sometimes say something that gets generalized too much, which is, you're just perfect the way you are. Some people are like, well, that doesn't sound like it. We should say that. I can have unconditional positive regard for a kid and say, I'm looking forward to you to continue to improve who you are, to continue to push and be a better version of yourself. What if I'm a 14-year-old kid and I'm depressed and anxious and I don't feel comfortable in my own skin, and I go to some counselor person like me and I look at that kid and say, you're just perfect the way you are. And the kid's sitting there thinking, I feel like crap. I don't want to feel this way. But what if I look at that kid and say, you're worth it, but you've got to work for being better. You can, and I'm going to help you feel better. I'm going to help you work to get better, but there's a better version of you moving forward, as opposed to, we got in the self-esteem movement, especially for those of us in our 40s and 50s. The self-esteem movement was a big boom that came out of the 60s and 70s, hit schools really hard in the 80s, which is where we're like, if we just tell kids they're all special rainbows, it's going to fix all the world's problems, because their self-esteem will be so high, they'll never make poor choices. Turns out it's not true. You develop a lot of facade. And then we teach teachers, just say nice things to kids no matter what. And the kid's like walking down the hallway and we're like, look at you, you good little breather. Tell you what, buddy, all day long, in and out, in and out. Well, you're a little champion. Let me get your trophy, right? But the problem with that is the kid starts to build a mentality of something for nothing. Well, the problem is the world doesn't operate on a something for nothing mentality. The world values your value. So what we have to do is teach kids to generate value. And we got to create better social structures that allow kids to generate value for a variety of skills and abilities, and not just athletics or just academics, but finding different things where kids can feel a sense of ability and value and contribution. And that's our responsibility to create a context for that. We can't just say, oh, participation trophies are junk, and then but not put the work in to say, we need to provide kids opportunities where they can feel value, contribution, and things like that. So I think that's the idea of self-concept with content. If I have a kid and I say, what value do you add? And that kid has no answer, now I've got work to do. If I look at that kid and I say, what value do you bring to this family? What value do you bring to this school? And that kid has no answer, that's me. I got to figure out, how do I create experiences for that young man, young woman, to have experiences that develop a sense of competency. Because the shortcut way is to do some, feelings coloring book. The hard thing is to give experiences, and then while they're having that experience, you give them a fist bump and you say, I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you did today. I can't tell you how proud I am of what you did. And you know what? You should be proud of yourself, because eventually we're not going to be in the room. And then that voice has to come from the inside, not from the outside. But it starts from the outside before they get it on the inside. And the one thing I'll mention about relationships, based in relationships, is, and this is a little bit aside, but it is an element I want to mention, is as parents, I think we really need to be thoughtful of the way that we view and interact with relationships that adolescents are having. One of the things that I'm concerned about that I see sometimes is an overcommitment to adolescent relationships. And what I mean by that is a couple kind of gets together, and then the families start to come together, and then the kids become so enmeshed. It's like Tommy and Tammy and Tommy and Tammy. What's your favorite color, Tommy? Whatever Tammy's is. And they're never apart. And what happens with that is, the danger of that is, when you're trying to identify who you are, but you have no separation from a person you're in a relationship with, you start to enmesh your identity. So what happens is, if that person leaves, you feel incomplete. And that's where you run into kids who can't ever be alone. They always have to be in a relationship because they're not comfortable being by themselves, which is a very dangerous thing, which means they'll latch on because of opportunity and not necessarily because of goodness of fit. So we teach kids, and I think one of the things I see that parents, we got to think about, and my wife and I have had to have these conversations sometimes where I'm saying this in a kind way, but I always tell my son, I don't ever get attached to girlfriends, because his girlfriends, he's had lots of really nice girls, but I treat them like stray dogs. I mean that in the kindest way. I know I'm not going to keep him. He's a 16, 17-year-old kid. The chance he's going to marry the girl he's dating right now are slim to none. It's less than 2% high school relationships make it on to be marriage. So I really like them, and they're really sweet kids and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not getting attached because I'm not going to keep them. Right? So I think the element but what happens is, sometimes the families, especially if the parents become connected to the other kid, or the parents' families start to do stuff together, then the kids don't feel safe in separating the relationships, because basically they're divorcing the families. Does that make sense? You start going on vacation together, and you start getting shirts made and blankets and socks and all this stuff. And what happens is, the kids get so enmeshed that they're like, I am going to ruin my family's experience if I break up with this person, because we're so connected. Does that make sense? So we got to pump the brake on that stuff a little bit. Just something to think about. Because we got to figure out who we are, and we got to try relationships on. Do you ever look back at relationships and saw how you learned what you liked and what you didn't like by the people that you dated? You got to try some of that stuff on, So, what should kids be doing? We should be thinking about decision making. How do you learn how to make decisions? By making decisions. The peak time for risk-taking is adolescence. 15 to 25 years old is the peak of accidents, is the number one leading cause of death. Second leading cause of death is suicide. If that doesn't chill you, I don't know what will. First leading cause of death is accidents. Second leading cause of death is suicide. Both of those. Now, why, when we think about the first one, risk-taking, why is risk-taking such a big thing? If my goal in adolescence is to practice adulthood and try things on, what I'm doing in that moment, I've got to take risks. I've got to separate. The teenage brain is pushed to separate from the primary family group. Why? Because that's what you have to do to be successful in the next phase. So you got to try stuff. And what also happens in the brain is the brain values reward over risk. You'll ask young people sometimes when they do stupid stuff, you'll say, didn't you know what would happen? Yeah, I thought it could happen, but I always tell them but I could have landed it. what if I land it, right? Like, I'm going to try this. It's going to be epic if I land it. If not, we'll have to see what goes there. But I think there's some element where it's like the incentive, because the way the brain's wired in adolescence, the incentive has a stronger value than the consequence. But it doesn't mean they don't understand consequences. It just means they're incentivized by the what if I make it and the social value that the landing it gets them, especially in a world where we broadcast our stuff. And we have models of people doing ridiculous things and they get all this money and attention. But we do want, an element of that is not for you to say, I don't want my kids to take risks. It's, I need to teach and have conversations with my kids about risk. I need to talk to my kids about where is that line between pushing, where I'm pushing a little bit and now I'm really in a place to where I could seriously harm myself or cause lifelong consequences. Having those kinds of conversations in that way. And they also are big time to seek novelty. They want to try stuff. We want kids to try stuff on. One of the things we think about with grit, everybody likes to talk about grit because it's a fancy conversation to have. One of the things we don't talk enough about grit is that an element of grit is the exploration phase, which we want kids to learn to work hard, but the first stage in learning how to work hard is having something you're willing to work hard at. So what do we need to do? Expose kids to multiple opportunities of things to work hard at. Expose kids to multiple things. And that's what I mean. And I'm an athlete, not anymore, obviously, but I'm a former athlete and sports were a very important part of my life. And they taught me a lot of things. And, they were a protective factor for me early in my life, having learning disability early in my life. They were a protective factor for me for value. But that doesn't mean that my kids need to become athletes. One of them happens to be an athlete. The other one loves to work on robotics. And he says to me, I'm like, buddy, I don't care what you do as long as you learn how to work hard at something. So figuring out what they're doing to seek out and try new things. And we know that peer interaction is that time when they're starting to invest in the future. By the time I would say past 6th grade, I had a family I was doing some work with, and the mom said to me, I want to be the star of her show. And the daughter was 16. I said, your role has passed. You are supporting cast. You get to be the star of the show up to about 6th grade typically. And now with things being pushed back, you could argue that sometimes it's 4th and 5th, depending on how early access they're having to certain levels of technology. But you get to be the star of the show early. But whenever it goes into the second act of childhood, peers become the star and you are now supporting cast. Doesn't mean you don't have a role and you don't throw your hands up and say it's not our responsibility anymore, but you are now a supporting cast and peers now become the primary thing. And here's the way to think about it in a pretty functional way, because now kids are trying to attach with people their age. Why? Because that's who they're going to be living with in their adulthood. So they've got to separate from you because we're going to die first. Typically, we're not going to be there. We're not going to help them get jobs. We're going to be the ones that are back behind, and the peers are going to be the people that facilitate their life forward. So they have to separate from us and move on into peers. And there's this interesting element where the research indicates that social exclusion, the brain interprets it similar to being socially isolated or be physically hurt. So think about that. The adolescent brain views being socially isolated the same as being physically hurt. So when you look at a kid who's getting bullied or a kid that's having a rough day and you say, it's not that big a deal, understand that in their brain, it's the same as if they're being physically hurt. So consider it that way. And one of the biggest things we do as adults is we say things to make ourselves feel better as opposed to sitting in it for just a minute with them. Like you ever think about a teenager after they break up with someone and the adults always want to make the kid feel better and they say there's other fish in the sea. And what about that cute boy from church camp or anything like that? Never seen an adolescent go, you know what, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm feeling 100% better, right? If you think of yourself, you ever had a breakup when you were a kid or a young person and Open Arms comes on the TV on your car and you got to pull over for a minute, right? If you don't know what the Open Arms is, never mind. But it's hard. You think about that stuff. So sometimes with kids, when they're having these experiences, we got to think, this kid's hurting. And I don't just mean in an emotional sense. This kid's hurting in a physical sense. And sometimes it's okay to look at a kid and go, this is going to suck for a minute. This is just going to suck for a minute. But I'm with you. I can't completely understand what it's like to be you right now. I have a sense of similar experiences in my life, But if you just need me to sit and be with you, we can do that. Or if you want to talk about it, we can do that. But I acknowledge that what you're dealing with right now just sucks. And just stop. Don't you have to tell them the only thing that heals it is time, and think of your mom and I and all this stuff. Then just be in it with them. Because too often we're saying things because we don't want to see them uncomfortable, so we say things to make ourselves feel better, hopefully because we don't want them to be uncomfortable anymore. So when we talk about, to wrap up that experiential deprivation element, is really think about what experiences kids are missing out on while they're in their room on devices, not engaging. Like one of the things we know right now is, like for example, driver's license. Like I'm sure a lot of people know the statistic that fewer and fewer teenagers are getting their license at 16 years old now. You know one of the top reasons why they say they don't get their license? What do you think? They're afraid. They're scared. Or the word we use for everything, anxiety. Is anxiety a real thing? Absolutely. Is it overstated these days? Absolutely. But a large percentage of kids that don't get their license at 16 say it's because of their anxiety. Now what that tells you is, anxiety is fear of the unknown, which tells you they don't feel the competence to navigate the complicated situation of driving. Now the problem with, I'm not saying every kid has to get their license at 16, but what I'm saying is being part of developing that separation is mobility. And if I don't have mobility, I don't have separation, which means I can't explore, which means I'm going to have a further deficit because I'm not engaging with the world at a higher level as I should be at 16, 17 years old. And I have anxiety is really a call to action as opposed to, okay, well, I don't want to make you uncomfortable. It's what are we going to do to build your skills so you feel like you can do that? Because what can happen is I can just hide in my phone in my room and then my parents can Uber me around. Or I don't go anywhere because I can interact with the people I want to interact with on my device in this distilled version of social interaction. So it's something we look at, not getting a license. Risk-taking's down with young people. Like things like that, like inappropriate sexual activity, all that stuff, down. I'm not like rooting for it, don't get me wrong. But it tells you that kids aren't taking risks, which tells you they're not developing. Like look at your own childhood and the risks you took. And you ever have a memory? I have these. You ever have a memory when you think about it, you like shiver? And you're the only person that experiences, you're like, oh man, well, yeah. Like something you did, and you can't even say it out loud, it's so uncomfortable. And I was a pretty good kid, but there's things that I just think, oh my gosh. But you think about, like, what would I be had I not done those things? What would I be had I not made those mistakes? What would I be if my parents knew every moment where I was and I never had the opportunity to make a mistake and have to navigate my way through it? Like, what would I be now? I'm pretty confident I wouldn't be what I am now. And I think that's an element to consider. So let's talk about specific content impact. I always tell this to teenagers. If you are not paying for something, you're probably the product that's being sold. So the fact that things like Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, all that kind of stuff is free, the reason why it's free is because you're the product being sold. Your attention is the currency. And I think it's important that we understand that's what the market is selling, is attention. And the second element is the systems that are selling our attention, the algorithms that are being developed, have no conscience. They have objectives. That's a tricky thing about AI that we still don't understand fully, is you can give AI a goal, and then AI tries to figure out how to meet that goal. But the AI has no conscience in meeting that goal. And we can't count on social media companies to really regulate themselves when their profit. It's like there's an element of like when you're buying a car from somebody and they make a commission off of how much they sell you the car for, it's really hard for them to be completely objective because they benefit from the increased price that you pay. I'm not saying if someone's a car salesman, I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm just saying it's a conflict. It's a conflict. So I think the element is, when we look at this, the side of it is, the algorithm is really not concerned. You know what it wants? It wants frequency, it wants the duration and intensity of interaction. So it wants you to stay on the app longer, and it wants you to interact at a higher level. Those are the goals it's given. And then the algorithm learns from how long you look at it and how much you interact with it, and it feeds you what you eat. And if you've not interacted with social media much, it is amazing how good it is at manipulating the algorithm to give you what you'll continue to attend to. And there is a lot of theories and there's a lot of truth behind this of how it does tend to lean towards more extreme behaviors and more extreme things. Because our brains, that's why our news is, 95% negative and only 5% positive, because we are more likely to watch negative things than we are positive things, because that's the way our neurology is wired. So we start looking at this element. So why do we talk about dopamine? I'm not going to go too far into this. It's a good thing to know about what it is and how it works. And the big thing that we talk about with dopamine is it's involved in pleasure and movement. It rewards you for moving toward goals, but it also rewards you from pleasurable experiences. So it has those two elements. But the thing with dopamine is, it's the element, I'll show you this right here, is that what rises has to fall. So when you have a peak of dopamine, it has to have a proportionate trough, is what we call it. So when you have a good experience, it's super high. The way that your body, all things seek equilibrium, like biology, 9th grade, right? So everything that goes up must come down. So the equilibrium is, if we have a peak in dopamine, it has to trough. So I think what's important to realize is things that have a high dopaminergic response, which have a high reward, also can trough out. Like if you ever had something really cool happen, or come home from vacation and you have that experience, or something you're really looking forward to, and after it happens, you kind of have that trough. What that is that's your brain's way of kind of finding that equilibrium. And we'll talk about how some apps play to that in just a minute. But the real key thing, and a lot of this comes from addiction research, the substance or experience with low effort and high dopaminergic response is highly addictive. So something that calls a high peak with little work, like for example, getting a doctorate, for example, is hard to get, takes a long time. So people don't get addicted to doctorates, right? People get addicted to cocaine. You know why? Because taking cocaine is a very immediate experience. It causes a high dopaminergic peak with low reward, which makes it highly rewarding, which is why it does this, which is why people get addicted to cocaine, is because of the high reward, low effort, which causes it to be highly rewarding in that way. So let's talk about TikTok, for example. TikTok, the one thing we talk, some people call it doom scrolling. I call it dumb scrolling, and the reason why is because you don't always have to be reading something that's doom and gloom. But have you ever been interacting with Reels or TikTok or whatever, and while you're using it, you're like, why am I still doing this? You know who else has that experience? People that are addicted to substances. I have worked with people addicted to substances that will say, I know while I'm using that I hate myself for using, but I can't stop myself from using. A similar experience have you ever had, you ever tried to eat right and you find yourself in line at McDonald's and you're like, I'm going to feel awful after this. And you're like, and a large chocolate shake, right? And you're like, while you're doing it, you're loathing yourself, but you're still doing it. But it's the power of that element. And TikTok has that element. There's lots of people that will attest to the fact of while they're using, but it's they can't get themselves out of it. They can't pull themselves out of it. And that's because the way that it's designed is designed to pull you in that way. And the thing that we also know is that AI learning in TikTok is very, very smart, and it's very, very good with things like product placement and suggestion. Trust me, we can talk about social issues all we want, but follow what business does, because that's what tell you what the reality is. Business will pay for what works. And product placement in TikTok works because they're paying for it. They wouldn't put money into it if it didn't work. So looking at those elements of how it manipulates and how, I think teaching young people, the thing that I would suggest, teaching young people about what's under the hood with TikTok helps them become a better thinker. Teach them how to be a better thinker in that way. I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable, but we do need to talk about pornography. One of the things I think about pornography is I argue that this is one of the biggest issues we have with, it disproportionately affects adolescent males right now. The problem with pornography is, I just said, something that has low barriers for use, but high dopaminergic response can become highly addictive. And today, access to pornography is unbelievably easy. So young people have access to pornography on multiple devices. And what happens is, and this is something I think that is really important to think for young men, or young boys, and females too, but the statistics are that boys are more likely to use image-based pornography, and in general, we're talking averages, females are more likely to access literary pornography, which is when anybody argues with me about that, I'm like, who bought Shades of Grey? Was there a bunch of big country guys walking out of Walmart with their copy of 50 Shades of Grey? Can't wait to get into this one. No, it was mostly middle-aged females. Again, if you want to know what really works, look at what business trends tell you, not what social conversations sometimes say, but what's the business side of it say. So one of the things we know that's it's highly addictive for young adolescent males. It's easily accessible. But the other thing that I think we need to talk about is because it has that rise and fall, the peak, okay, so the sexual experience that a young boy, I'm assuming, typically has in the use of pornography, that peak, but then remember what comes up must come down. But the neurology of that is it drops and then prolactin increases. If you know about like breastfeeding and all that stuff, you probably know about prolactin. But prolactin for human beings, the reason why males have an increase in prolactin, because you'd be scientific for a minute, after mating, right, what it does is it settles the male. It makes the male hold still for pair bonding. This is not a debate, this is a biological element. So what it does is, after mating has taken place, then they trough, and then prolactin kicks in, which says, hey, you hold still and connect. And while you hold still and connect, this is pair bonding, and the pair bonding is meant then to facilitate people that will have a child and all that kind of stuff. Well, the problem is that's the mechanism I'm using, and I'm a 15-year-old boy, and I'm doing this up and down multiple times in a week, right? And I have high levels of prolactin, I can enter into a depressive state. And my motivation becomes, and now my reward system in my brain, my dopamine in my brain, my dopamine system is rocked. So I can look lack of motivation, I can feel depressed, because after that, I have no one to bond with, I have no relationship, I'm by myself in some space, and I'm actually not really proud of myself. And then let that experience happen 20, 25 times a week. I don't know what the going rate is these days, but think of that idea, and that's where it can absolutely wreck the neurology of an adolescent male. Does that make sense? So educating on some of those things and figuring out and I think we'll talk more about how that factors in. And also it becomes, one of the things we're really noticing is distorted ideas of relationships and sexual schema. The objectification of women becomes an increased issue, a lack of the ability to understand progression in relationships and permission and exchange and all that kind of stuff. It's like, I don't know if you've seen a movie of one of the movies online or the pornographic movies, but there's not usually a long courting period, right? So there's this element of where they're not getting a true sense of what it means to have a relationship and exchange and give and take and value. It's, you're the object, now we're done. And now, so what happens is they don't develop a sense of what real relationships and bonding would be. So I think it really can become contaminated in that way. So those are things we start to see. And then what you'll notice too is they're showing this in the research, more extreme versions of pornography are being used, because it's just like when your first beer you can have 2 and it affects you, and then it takes 6, then it takes a case or whatever it might be. The same thing goes with pornography. What worked was maybe an image at one point, then becomes this and this and this, and now we start moving into things like violent-based pornography and things like that. So it's something I have to mention because it is one of the things that I'm seeing the most impact on adolescent males right now. Snapchat, again, one of the things we talk about with Snapchat, well, the big thing, anybody know about streaks? Yeah, you ever watch an adolescent have a complete meltdown if their streaks might get broken? Like the world is coming to an end, right? That kind of thing. One of the things that the streaks are where they have an exchange back and forth, and they try to keep a chain of streaks together where they go back and forth with one another. It can facilitate an obsessive compulsive mentality, which is where I have to do my streaks so much. I've had kids where they'll hire other kids to keep their streaks going. I've had parents who will do the streaks for their kids while their kids are like at a camp or whatever, because the kids just cannot fathom the idea that any of their streaks would be broken. And then also when streaks are broken, it plays a big element of social acceptance, which is our relational currency is our streak. So that's the only way. And every day I'm having to invest in our relational currency, because if I break this streak, somehow that must mean our relationship isn't good. So this element of Snapchat can create this vibration of anxiety and obsessive compulsive nature because of what that means and what would happen if it would go. Instagram and Snapchat are image-based versions of social media, and something to think about with those is it disproportionately affects females. And again, I'm talking in generalities. There are, of course, males that have trouble with it too. And Jonathan Haidt, the book that some of you guys got when you came in, talks a lot about in detail. It's probably one of the best books. It's been one of the most important books been written in quite some time. And what it disproportionately affects females, because females are more likely to use image-based social media. Males are more likely to use YouTube and video games in general. more likely to watch a bunch of videos, and more like, that doesn't mean boys don't use Snapchat. It just means that it's predominantly, females are more negatively affected by it. And it also, we know that boys on average are more likely to have what we would call person-to-person or physical aggression, where females are more likely to have relational aggression. And Snapchat and Instagram, places like that, are a playground for relational aggression. Things like leaving people out, right? Don't like anything she posts, or post a bunch of pictures of us doing fun things so she knows she's not part of our group. Things like that, where we can relationally bully people in that context with very little adult supervision, which also factors into that FOMO idea. Like when you're younger, you may not have known what everybody was doing, but now if you're not engaged in the social community, so you can sit on your phone and see all the things you're not involved in and just how much not in the group you are. And it's a steady reminder of, look at all this stuff that I'm not a part of, and it can be quite overwhelming for a young person to have that constantly on display. And the other side we look at is the unrealistic beauty standards, which that's always been a real thing, but then the distorted social value. Why is that one really important? Because the distorted social value, what that is, I had a young lady who's a friend of mine's daughter, and she said to me, she goes, all right, Dr. Jim, fix this one for me. I'm on the debate team. I posted a picture of me with my award from my debate thing that I won, and I got 75 likes on Instagram at that time, Instagram. A girl in my class, this is in the wintertime, posted a picture of herself in a bikini in the snow. She got 450 likes. How am I supposed to interpret that? I said, that's a real good question. But that's where kids are living. That's the environment that they're in. And I said, you know what? The question you have to ask yourself then is, how much value do you place on those 450 likes? And how much value are you placing on those 75 likes? Where are you? Is your value constantly on trial? And for some of our kids, and fortunately this young lady had a good support network and is very bright, so she could process that. Imagine a young person that doesn't have a good support network and they're constantly fishing out for their social value. Every post is a valuation on their value to their peers. You see where that would kind of factor in with that? And that's the thing we kind of think about. Where this factors in from a statistical standpoint, this is hospital admissions for non-fatal self-harm. Okay, this is for boys. You look at the rates; they're pretty even. And this is for females. If you look at and Haidt talks a lot about this, but this is from not his research, but 2009, 2010s, where you started to see the iPhone start to have the forward-facing camera. You start seeing Instagram come in, things like that. The largest group that had an increase in severity of non-fatal self-harm was 10 to 14-year-old females. So we saw, look there, you see a 189% increase in hospitalizations for 10 to 18-year-old females. So those of you who work in elementary schools, you know this is touching you, this is getting you too. This isn't just a teenage situation. And what we're having is the equipment's not different, the brain isn't, but the information they're getting is earlier and they're not capable of really handling it as well. So it's overwhelming their capacity. So you're seeing them be exposed to things at an earlier age that is way outside of their capacity to handle, which is why we got to really think about, like, at what point are they being seeing these things. We do know, and this is suicide. Suicide rate in general among adolescents has continued to climb, but especially among young girls, 10 to 14 years old. We see that really boom up, 151% increase. And the reason why that's important, we need to be really being thoughtful about the exposure that they're having. Video games, I'll talk briefly about video games because we're going to run out of time. But why video games are important, disproportionately affects males, but females will play it too. More likely, boys are going to play first-person role games. They're going to play Fortnite. They're going to play Siege. They're going to play those kinds of things. A little bit of Roblox in there too. But one of the things that you find with video games that makes them so appealing, especially for some of our kids that maybe aren't feeling the value in the real world or social physical space, is that it's a time thief, which is the experiential deprivation piece, which I'm not engaging with society. I'm not doing my homework. I'm not doing that stuff. Second is it can desensitize kids to violence. Video games don't make perfectly stable, sane kids violent. They can make a kid who is teetering on the edge of violence lean more towards violence, but they're not the only thing that turns this kid into a Columbine situation. That's an exaggeration, but it can desensitize kids to things like gore, blood, violence, aggression, those kinds of things. And the last one is, and this is the one I've seen the most with, I've worked with a lot of young males, of course, in their late teens, early 20s and things like that, where that don't feel like they have a lot of value in the world. It offers almost like an avatar of value. I remember I had a guy one time I was working with was when World of Warcraft was big. And he said to me, it's a really bright thing that he said to me, he goes, in the world, I'm a nobody. But in the game, I'm a death knight. I'm a level 80 death knight. And I have respect and people. So he wanted to be in that because in that world, he had status. And one of the big things especially is to have a sense of competency and status. So you can see where that would become an intoxicating existence where I think I'm just going to escape into that because in that world, but the problem is with that is, and him and I had a real good relationship and eventually we got to the place and I said, because he wanted a relationship. Because he wanted to have a relationship. I said, here's the problem I'm running into, buddy. I've not heard about a lot of young ladies knocking on doors looking for level 80 death knights. I don't know a lot of them. Like, I know he's in there drinking Red Bull and eating Hot Pockets. I can't wait to meet him, right? But here's where our responsibility is. I go back to the beginning, what I said before. If I have a kid, when I ask them what value do you add to society, and they don't have an answer to that question, then us as adults got to figure out how we're going to create those opportunities for value for that kid. We got to help them because the escape will always be better if we don't support. And now here's the thing, and you know this. Sometimes for kids it's surviving a certain season of life to get to the better season of life. Sometimes it's surviving middle school or surviving high school to get to the place to where you can get around people that are more like you. And I don't know about you, some of you, but like maybe when you got to college or maybe when you got to work, you survived some of the other things. You maybe didn't thrive in those environments, but you made it. And then you got to the place where you could add some value. You got to the place to where things weren't always judged on GPA and how fast you could run a 40. But it was, specific skills that you had. But I do think we can roll that back into schools and figuring out how we're getting kids access to those experiences earlier. So what do? The first thing we have to figure out is it's not a fair fight to put it all on your shoulders. You're up against entities that have much more money than you and much more power than you. You cannot win this on your own. And if we continue to point the finger only at families and say it's your fault, it's your responsibility, then that's not fair. It has to have levels. Here's what I would encourage you to consider. At the individual level, are you a good role model of the use of technology? I don't know how many times, there's a good test. You guys have Meijer. We have Walmart, but you guys have Walmart too. But get in line and let the line build up a little bit and look over. And as the line builds, see how long it takes people to get their phone out of their pocket. Adults. Kids we don't have just a kid issue with technology. We have a societal issue with technology. And how can we teach kids how to be responsible consumers of technology when we're all sitting in the living room alone in a crowded room? It just can't work. Let me tell you, maybe there's someone in here who's a heart surgeon, but most people overvalue how accessible they need to be. Oh, it's work. Are you getting a 6 p.m. text that's an 8 a.m. problem? I think that's the thing we got to think about. Because I think sometimes, I got to answer this is work. It's like, well, yeah, because they've learned that they can text you at 7 o'clock at night and you're going to answer, a tomorrow question tonight and things like that. So I think, and also are we first good role models in the use of technology? And I think and I'm hearing it even in relational issues. I'm in the clinic now and we do some marital stuff. It's one of the top things I'm seeing that's disrupting marriages right now too, is he or she's always on their phone. Or they're not paying attention. So the first thing starts with, do we value the relationships in our life to model what that looks like? What are our family expectations? This is an easy thing to think about. Are there times, I'm not telling you to take your kids' phones and throw them in the lake or whatever, but have we even thought about, and this is a hard thing that we've really implemented in our house we're doing a good job with, that was hard at first, was are there phone-free times? When we're eating a meal, we're not on devices. When we're watching a movie together, we're not on devices. If I'm picking you up from school and I'm driving you home, no earbuds. I'm just weird. My rule was when I picked the boys up from practice, after practice is no earbuds on the way home. we're going to do weird things like, I'm going to talk to you about your day. It's going to be really strange. What's funny about it is his buddies, one of my son's friends, Ethan, who's just a fantastic kid, he was in the car, and then another kid gets in the car, and the other kid gets in the car and starts putting his earbuds in. And Ethan goes, hey, take your earbuds out. We're going to talk about our feelings. So why do I think that's so important? I genuinely believe this, and I've been proven, I believe this wholeheartedly. I think we act like kids don't want our time and attention, but I think often what we're doing is we're not giving them our time and attention in a genuine way, because I found that kids, if we get them in the right place at the right time and genuinely, it doesn't mean in the beginning they're going to sit down and go, all right, let's go. Let's feel it out. No, but it means as they will acclimate faster than you think. And then they'll value it more in the future. So when we start creating that space, like we're going to sit and we have dinner and we're going to talk about our day. When we ride in the car, an easy thing you could start with, just something about today, is what space can you create for you in your relationships with the young people in your life, where you look at them and say, my interactions with you are so important that you or I are not going to have our devices out. That's how important. I think what it hit me most is when my boys started getting older and I realized there was a clock in my head. Like, my son's 17. I've already spent the majority of the time I'm ever going to spend with him in my life. The majority of the time I'm ever going to spend with my son is gone at 17. Like, it's a minuscule amount of time I'm going to spend with him versus what I've already spent. Most of it's gone. And I think there was an earlier moment of panic where I was like, holy crap. When I'm riding in the car with this kid, I want it all. I'm in. I want to talk about it. I want to go. And I'm a human being, and I get annoyed, and I need space just like anybody else. But are we thinking about how that time's protected? At the community level, what are the school practices? What are the organizational practices? Not always a popular thing. But there's lots of research that we're seeing now about schools that create high restrictions on phones are seeing a real boost in teacher morale and student morale. And if you can weather the political storm, which is usually a political storm of anxiety-provoked parents, if you can weather that storm, if you can get to the other side of it, what we're seeing is really good outcomes for kids, educationally and socially. We talk about hallways start to come alive, kids start to talk to each other, teachers start to enjoy kids more. And if the argument is, what do I do if there's a school? Do some reading on that. It's an overblown idea. But what if there's a crisis? What if there's a crisis is we need the people who are in charge of our buildings to help protect our kids with the systems that they create. But we can't think that a 15-year-old with a cell phone is going to completely derail. That's not their responsibility to do that. Probably what they're going to end up doing is being distracted because they're trying to record or call people and not following the directions of the adults that are trying to keep them safe. That's what the actual research shows us is. Kids are distracted by the phone in crisis because they're too busy trying to call people and video things as opposed to following the directions of the adults or following the instructions that they're given for crisis management. That's the reality of the conversation that we have in that. And at the government level, I don't know if we can count on Congress. I hope we can. But they're going to, you can't expect social media companies to regulate themselves. They'll do a little bit of it to present the veneer as if they're being socially conscious, but in the end understand that their profits are what they're beholden to. So it's like big tobacco. I do think it has happened before. Some of you are old enough, and not as old as me to remember. Does anybody remember cigarette vending machines? You used to be able to put money, for you kids, you used to be able to put money in a machine and pull a knob, and cigarettes would drop out of the bottom of it. And no one could see you do it. And we were like, and everybody was like, okay, right? Now, if we had that, I think but it's going to take almost like a big tobacco attack from the government to regulate that. Does that make sense? So it's not like we've not done it before. This is a much more complicated genie, right, to manage, but it's not like we haven't done it before. So this is what I'll leave you with. I encourage you to, I love Ted Lasso. If you haven't watched it, put years on your life. I encourage you to, when you leave this, there's a tendency to be on fire about it and to go home and you walk in, your 15-year-old son looks at you and you go, stop it. Just stop that. And you're like, what am I doing? You know what you're doing. You stop it, right? Don't do that. When you go home, start a conversation with the kids. Be curious. Let them teach you about it. Start thinking about what's a reasonable conversation. What are some reasonable parameters that you can put on yourself and that you can put on them that moves you in a more progressive element. So when I go back to, remember what I said, experiential deprivation and content impact, and then think about what are things I can do in my kid's life that's going to help them be ready to be a functional adult? What are opportunities I can give my kid to do hard things, to take risks, to learn how to order their own food, to schedule their own appointments, to trust them to go to the grocery store, use a debit card? How am I building my son or daughter's competency to engage the world? Because that's where they're going to develop their mental health, is from what value they see in themselves, because the value they see in themselves is the value that they're going to bring to the world. So how can I, one, engage in the conversation with the young people in my life, and two, create opportunities for them to feel a sense of value and ability, so that way when they engage with the world, they feel capable and confident. And that will be the ultimate protective factor for them against a large number of the mental illnesses that can become challenges. And it's not simple, but like we say to lecturing kids all the time, nothing worth having is easy to get. This is going to be really hard, and it takes us all to do it. But if something's important, it has intentional practices. So I hope what we can do is participate in the conversation together and come at it from what do our kids need these days, not they're broken kids, but what do our kids need these days, and start making these small incremental changes and doing it with kids, not to kids. And it doesn't always mean they're going to like it, but at least they can see that where we're coming from is we're trying to help them be more capable and engaged in society. So, and again, your time's not lost on me. I appreciate what this says about you for the fact that you've sat there and listened to some guy with a country accent talk for an hour and 15 minutes. If you need to track me down, I'll just show you this real quick. How do I click on stuff? That's how you track me down. I know, look at me having Instagram and stuff up there. It's a tool, but one of the things I would say is the Height book's fantastic. Check it out, read it. There's a lot of good information in that book. Can't thank Paul, Shelley, everybody, Shelby. We've got Shelly and Shelby. Shelly, Jennifer, everybody for letting me be a guest here. I appreciate that. So have a good evening. I'll answer questions afterwards.